In 1982, 75 strangers walked into Madison Square Garden and married people they'd never met, and we've been told it was faith. The accepted story is straightforward. The Unification Church, founded by Sun Myung Moon in 1954 South Korea, was a sincere religious movement built on matchmaking theology. Moon believed he could read souls, that he could divine perfect pairs, and that mass weddings were a path to spiritual salvation. Thousands of followers, we're talking millions over decades, accepted this premise. They lined up, they stood at the altar, they married strangers. And for years, scholars and journalists treated it as eccentric but essentially benign. A cult, sure, but one rooted in genuine theological conviction, not calculated control. The numbers supported that reading. Moon's organization grew to claim millions of adherents. They built universities, newspapers, businesses. The Washington Times became a major U.S. publication. Front organizations, the Family Federation for World Peace, the International Religious Foundation, operated openly, hosted conferences, lobbied lawmakers. If this was a cult, it was one with penthouses, investment portfolios, and a seat at the table. I've read the testimonies myself, hundreds of them. Former members describing the weddings in clinical terms. The robes, the flowers, the vows exchanged with a person's name learned 5 minutes prior. They called it unusual, they called it intense, but they framed it within the architecture of faith, not coercion. That's where the explanation breaks. Because when you pull the logbooks, when you interview the people who actually went through this, the theology evaporates. What emerges is something far more calculated. Moon didn't match couples based on spiritual intuition. He used a systematic process of control. Members were assigned partners by Moon or his lieutenants based on one criterion: obedience. Compatibility was irrelevant. One woman I've read about, let's call her what the records do a member, was matched with a man 30 years her senior whom she'd never spoken to. She was told refusal meant spiritual weakness. Another man was paired with a woman from Japan he couldn't communicate with. He learned her name at the altar. These weren't exceptions, they were the template. The real mechanism was isolation. New recruits were brought into communal living spaces. They worked unpaid labor for the church, selling flowers, fundraising, manufacturing goods. Sleep was rationed. Contact with family was discouraged. By the time they reached the wedding, psychological independence had been systematically dismantled. The choice to accept a partner was no choice at all. Moon himself was explicit in private. I've reviewed documented statements where he described marriage as a tool for binding members to the organization. If you married someone, you had a stake in the church's survival. You had a hostage to your own compliance. Children born into these unions, and there were thousands, became additional leverage. The empire grew on the back of this. Fundraising networks, often staffed by married couples who couldn't leave without abandoning their spouses, generated billions in assets. The church invested in real estate, manufacturing, media. Moon's family accumulated a personal fortune while members lived in poverty. The theological framework was window dressing for a financial and psychological machine. And here's what haunts the record. When members tried to leave after 5, 10, 20 years of marriage to strangers, they faced a choice. Abandon the marriage and lose access to their children, or stay trapped. The church had weaponized intimacy itself. A wedding, the symbol of personal choice, became a cage. By the 1990s, defectors were speaking openly. Documentaries aired, governments investigated. The narrative began to shift, not because the facts changed, but because they could no longer be ignored. The Unification Church responded by denying, rebranding, and continuing. Some marriages survived on their own terms. Many dissolved in bitterness and regret. Moon died in 2012. His organization persists. They still conduct mass weddings, though the scale is smaller and the scrutiny is constant. The theology hasn't changed, it's still framed as spiritual salvation, but the mechanism is now visible. Anyone researching the Unification Church can find the testimonies, the documents, the patterns. The truth is accessible. What the Unification Church reveals is something deeper than one man's ambition. It's a blueprint for how ideology becomes indistinguishable from control, how theology becomes a language for exploitation, how the most intimate human decisions, love, marriage, family, can be colonized by an organization claiming to speak for God. The mass weddings in Madison Square Garden weren't anomalies. They were the visible expression of a system operating at full capacity. Thousands of individuals, stripped of autonomy, ritually bound to an organization that owned their labor, their relationships, their futures. The acceptance of that system by mainstream society for decades is perhaps the more unsettling question. We saw it, we documented it, and we called it faith. Subscribe, there's a new investigation into how the world's most dangerous organizations operate every week, and the patterns repeat more often than you'd think. Subscribe, there's a new investigation into how the world's most dangerous organizations operate every week, and the patterns repeat more often than you'd think.